What if the universe was not something outside us, but something reflected within? Long before Greece questioned the nature of being, and before China sought harmony under heaven, a civilization along the banks of the Indus began asking, "Who am I? What is the source of all this? And how can one be free?" Indian philosophy was born not in temples of logic, but in the fires of ritual, in the silence between hymns, in the yearning to understand existence itself. It is one of the world's oldest continuous traditions, not a single school, but a vast conversation across millennia. A dialogue between reason and revelation, between self and cosmos, between life and liberation. In the beginning were the Vedas, hymns sung by priestly poets to the divine forces of nature, fire, wind, dawn, storm. They were not just prayers, but poems of perception, attempts to weave the human voice into the rhythm of the universe itself. In their verses, the cosmos was not a machine, but a living order. Rita, the harmony that holds both stars and rituals together, the invisible thread through which all things move in time. But as centuries turned, a new restlessness stirred in the human spirit. If Rita governed the world, what governed the self? If ritual fire could sustain the heavens, what could illuminate the mind? If the gods heard our hymns, who was it that heard within us? From these questions, quiet, dangerous, inward, a new kind of literature was born. The Upanishads. Other sages left behind the smoke of sacrifice and turned their gaze from the outer altar to the inner flame. The word itself, Upanishad, means to sit close, as one sits beside a teacher in stillness, waiting for truth to be whispered rather than declared. Here, philosophy replaced performance. The divine was no longer something to be appeased, but something to be understood. And that understanding was not about gods or heavens, it was about being itself. They spoke of the Atman, the self within, not as the ego that thinks and desires, but as the silent witness of all thought, the pure consciousness behind every changing scene. And they spoke of Brahman, the vastness that breathes through all things, the unseen reality from which the universe arises and to which it returns. To know Atman is to know Brahman, they said, for they are not two. The drop and the ocean are one and the same water. This was not mere theology. It was a radical philosophy of identity between the self and the absolute, between consciousness and the cosmos. In this shift, Indian thought revealed its true character. Not religious in the Western sense, but soteriological, a vision of liberation through knowledge. Its purpose was not worship, but awakening, an end to suffering through insight into the real. To see that what you are is not what you seem, not body, not memory, not desire, but that still, ungraspable awareness which cannot die. Here began the long lineage of Darshanas, or ways of seeing. Each school, whether the dualism of Samkhya, the logic of Nyaya, or the non-dualism of Vedanta, was not a creed but a lens through which to look upon reality. Their goal was not belief, but vision. For to see truly, they said, is to be free. Liberation, or moksha, was not an act of faith but an act of realization. The ending of ignorance, the dissolution of the illusion of separateness. In the Upanishadic silence, knowledge became salvation. The truth was no longer hidden in the thunder or the ritual, it was hidden in plain sight in the one who perceives. And so, the great turning occurred. The universe was no longer the priest's stage, but the philosopher's mirror. The fire that once burned in the altar was discovered within the heart. And the oldest question of all, what is the world? Transformed into the deepest question a human being can ask, who am I? From this revelation unfolded centuries of dialogue. Indian philosophy diversified into 6 classical schools. The Darshanas, meaning ways of seeing. Each offered a lens to perceive truth, and yet all shared a single goal. Moksha, liberation from ignorance and rebirth. The first was Nyaya, the school of logic. Its thinkers asked, with both rigor and reverence, how do we know what is true? They turned their gaze inward and outward, mapping the mind's instruments: perception, inference, comparison, and testimony, the very tools by which reality can be apprehended. Truth, they insisted, is not a gift handed down or inherited. It must be reasoned, tested, and verified. In this pursuit, clarity of thought becomes a path to freedom. For to see rightly is to loosen the bonds of illusion that shroud the self. Every error, every misperception is not mere accident, but a subtle misalignment between cognition and the world. And to correct it is to step closer to a knowledge that liberates. Alongside Nyaya stood Vaisheshika, a philosophy of nature that sought to uncover the architecture of reality itself. It envisioned the world as composed of eternal atoms, each substance, quality, and motion woven together in a cosmos governed by laws and relations. This was an early form of scientific thinking, a taxonomy of being in which all that exists can be named, counted, and comprehended. Yet even in its meticulous account of matter, Vaisheshika sensed a deeper rhythm, a pulse that suggested the material world was never merely inert. Within atoms and their interactions lingered traces of the divine, a silent resonance connecting the finite and the infinite. Substance and quality, cause and effect, the individual and the universal. Everything hung together in an intricate dance, and in understanding this web, the mind glimpses the possibility of transcending mere appearances. Together, Nyaya and Vaisheshika embody a vision of philosophy as a soteriological enterprise. Reasoning and analysis are not ends in themselves, but tools for liberation. To know the world clearly is not only to grasp its mechanics, but to relieve oneself from the suffering that comes from ignorance, from mistaking shadow for substance. In this, these schools anticipate a profound ethical and existential insight that liberation, the cessation of bondage to illusion, is inseparable from the pursuit of truth. The mind, disciplined and illuminated, becomes the doorway through which the self glimpses freedom. And the cosmos, orderly yet suffused with mystery, becomes a mirror of the infinite. Then came Samkhya, one of the oldest and most profound systems of dualism. It proclaimed that reality is woven from two eternal threads: Purusha, pure, silent consciousness, the unmoved witness of all, and Prakriti, the ever-changing fabric of matter, restless, creative, and ceaselessly manifesting in forms both subtle and gross. The Samkhya sages taught that suffering arises not from the motions of the world themselves, but from mistaking the mutable Prakriti for the immutable Purusha, from identifying with the dance of desire, thought, and form rather than with the eternal witness of existence. Liberation, they said, does not demand the alteration of the world, nor the acquisition of power or knowledge in the ordinary sense, but the awakening of consciousness to its own separateness, a recognition that it is always free, always already untouched, merely observing the unfolding of nature without being bound by it. From this insight, a path of practice emerged: yoga, where Samkhya illuminated the architecture of reality. Yoga provided the tools to dwell within it with clarity and presence. Through ethical discipline, focused concentration, meditative stillness, the mind, with its restless triad of sense perception, ego, and intellect, gradually becomes transparent, allowing the luminous Purusha to shine unimpeded. In Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, liberation is not a distant ideal or theological abstraction. It is an immediate experiential clarity. It is the quiet mastery of thought itself, the cessation of inner conflict, the freedom that arises when consciousness no longer mistakes the ephemeral for the eternal. In this realization, the heart witnesses the world's ceaseless flux, yet remains untouched, serene and sovereign, glimpsing the truth that has always been. The self is not bound, and freedom has never been elsewhere than in the silent, knowing presence of awareness itself. Another current, Mimamsa, looked not inward but outward, to duty, ritual, and moral law. Its scholars upheld the authority of the Vedas, regarding them not merely as texts, but as self-revealed wisdom, instruments through which the cosmos itself could be sustained. For Mimamsakas, the sacred words of the Vedas were living forces. When human action harmonized with Dharma, the very fabric of the universe remained intact. Language, ethics, and ritual, these were not abstract speculations, but practical tools of preservation. Every correctly performed sacrifice, every careful observance of duty, was a thread woven into the continuity of cosmic order. The human act, when aligned with truth, became an extension of the universe's own integrity. And then came Vedanta, the end of the Vedas, a current that turned the gaze inward even as it preserved the grandeur of Mimamsa's insight. Vedanta sought a synthesis, gathering the scattered reflections of the earlier schools into a vision of ultimate unity. At its core lay a singular, audacious claim: the self, the Atman, is not merely part of reality, it is identical with the absolute Brahman. In this understanding, the multiplicity of the world, all the apparent separations are the play of Maya, illusion, while only the one truly exists. By the 8th century, Shankara gave this vision its most famous expression through Advaita Vedanta, the philosophy of non-duality. He described the awakening that comes from realizing that liberation is not an attainment, but a recognition. The self has always been free, the Atman never bound. Other thinkers, like Ramanuja and Madhva, offered variations, a qualified unity, a dualism. Yet all were united in the conviction that understanding reality, and thereby transcending ignorance, is the path to liberation. Vedanta, in this way, exemplifies the uniquely integrated nature of Indian philosophical thought. Each school combines metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics into a cohesive system, not as a religious dogma, but as a rigorous framework for ending suffering through knowledge. What is striking is the precision with which these systems confront existence itself, the nature of consciousness and matter, the mechanisms of causation, the illusions that obscure reality, and the disciplined practices, meditation, reflection, ritual, that lead one toward insight. Mimamsa teaches that correct action preserves the cosmos. Vedanta reveals that true knowledge frees the self from it. Across the schools, one finds a consistent theme. Suffering is rooted in ignorance, and liberation, moksha, is the reward of understanding. Whether that understanding comes through witnessing, reasoning, ethical action, or meditation, through Vedanta, Indian thought achieves a metaphysical grandeur and an ethical subtlety that rivals the greatest of Western philosophical endeavors. It presents a universe in which knowing the truth is not merely intellectual, but profoundly transformative. To grasp the self is to awaken to the whole of reality, and in that awakening, to end the bondage of suffering. Here, philosophy is not an abstract exercise, but an intimate lived journey toward freedom. A testament to the depth and sophistication of a civilization whose insights have, for too long, remained hidden behind the veils of Sanskrit. But philosophy in India was never confined to a single faith, nor reducible to theology alone. Around the 6th century before Common Era, a prince abandoned the shelter of his palace in search of a way to end human suffering. And thus began Buddhism, a path not of worship, but of acute attention to experience itself. The Buddha did not speak of a creator God. He spoke of dukkha, the persistent unsatisfactoriness of existence, of desire as its root, and of the possibility of liberation through insight and disciplined practice. He outlined a practical route for transformation, the Eightfold Path, through which the individual cultivates right understanding, ethical conduct, mindfulness, and meditative clarity, the very tools for disentangling oneself from the chains of craving and delusion. As centuries unfolded, Mahayana Buddhism expanded this vision beyond the individual. Liberation became a universal calling. The Bodhisattva, awakened yet remaining amidst suffering, embodied the intertwining of love and wisdom, action and insight. Philosophical subtleties deepened. The Madhyamaka school probed the radical interdependence of all things, showing that no phenomenon possesses independent existence. Emptiness is not nihilism, but a liberation from the illusions that bind desire and suffering. In dialogue, the Yogacara school turned inward, exploring consciousness itself as the canvas upon which the world appears, revealing that freedom is as much a shift in perception as in circumstance. These Buddhist explorations were part of a wider Indian philosophical universe, the Darshanas, which spanned the theistic, the ritualistic, and the non-theistic. Some, like the Samkhya and Vedanta schools, sought liberation through recognition of the true self and its unity with ultimate reality. Others, like Jainism, emphasized non-harm, detachment, and acceptance of the infinite complexity of the world, showing that truth is never one-sided. Even the Shrivaka, materialist and skeptical, challenged assumptions about afterlife, divinity, and moral obligation, insisting that knowledge begins in perception and that the human pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain is grounded in the tangible, immediate world. Across these diverse paths, remarkable unity emerges. Freedom from suffering is achieved not merely by renunciation, but by knowing the world and oneself with piercing clarity. Reality, whether conceived as emptiness, consciousness, or the non-dual unity of Atman and Brahman, is never an abstract puzzle. It is the ground upon which ethical, meditative, and cognitive practices converge, offering insight into how life can be lived with awareness, compassion, and equanimity. Through this rich tapestry of thought, Indian philosophy reveals that liberation is not the escape from life's trials, but the luminous perception of life as it truly is, moment by moment, relation by relation, mind by mind. Alongside Buddhism, another profound current of thought took shape in India, Jainism. At its heart lay the principle of Ahimsa, an ethic of radical nonviolence toward all living beings. To harm another, Jain thinkers insisted, is to harm oneself. For every soul is bound to the material world through the weight of its actions, through karma. Liberation, then, is not merely a reward, but the soul's own purification. Its gradual disentangling from the web of cause and effect and ascent toward its natural state of infinite awareness. The Jains also articulated the principle of Anekantavada, the doctrine of many-sided truth. Reality, they taught, is infinitely complex. Our perceptions, like the narrow beams of a lamp, can illuminate only fragments of it. No single viewpoint can ever grasp the whole. This insight fostered a profound humility before truth, one that became a cornerstone of India's ethical and intellectual ethos. But this philosophical subtlety extends beyond mere ethics. Like the Buddhist and other heterodox schools, Jainism is fundamentally non-theistic. Its aim not to invoke deities, but to chart a path of liberation from suffering. Its doctrines combine metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics into a seamless system, showing that the journey toward liberation is as much about understanding reality correctly as it is about living rightly. The Jaini insistence on multiple perspectives anticipates the deepest forms of skepticism, a recognition that reality cannot be captured by rigid dichotomies or unilateral claims. In this, it resonates with a recurring theme across Indian philosophy that suffering arises from ignorance, from clinging to incomplete or one-sided views, and that liberation requires both moral discipline and insight into the infinite subtlety of existence. In embracing these insights, Jainism invites a contemplation of life that is at once ethical, intellectual, and existential. An ongoing reflection on the consequences of our actions, the limitations of our knowledge, and the necessity of cultivating compassion for all beings. To live rightly, it teaches, is to move gently through a world whose ultimate nature is vast, it's complex, and resistant to any single interpretation. And in that movement, the soul finds its path toward freedom. Across centuries, these traditions, Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, debated, disagreed, and borrowed from one another. They refined logic, psychology, metaphysics, and ethics. But more than anything, they shared a conviction that philosophy is not only about thinking, but about being. Not only about the world, but about the transformation of the self. In the dialogue between argument and meditation, reason and revelation, India found a balance rarely matched, a civilization where philosophy was lived. Even as empires rose and fell, the philosophical spirit endured, evolving through commentary, reinterpretation, and practice. In the modern age, Indian philosophy continues to speak. In classrooms and monasteries, in movements of mindfulness and nonviolence. In the search for harmony between science and spirituality, it reminds us that truth is not merely discovered, it is realized. That wisdom is not inherited, it is lived. And perhaps, that liberation moksha was never somewhere else. It was always here, in the quiet recognition that the self and the cosmos are one. So, what is Indian philosophy? It is the oldest quest, the mirror of consciousness gazing at itself, journey from ritual to realization, from questioning the world to awakening within it. And maybe the real question is not what it teaches. but what it awakens in those who listen. Which idea resonated with you most? Share your reflection in the comments and join us again as we continue the search for timeless wisdom.